Okay, so in this video we're going to learn how to rearrange our standard form equations into slope-intercept so that we can see with our eyes the slope and the y-intercept, because remember, y equals mx plus b format is where you don't have to really do any work to see the slope or the y-intercept. You just have to know where to look. Unfortunately, you can't do that with standard form, so it's easy if we rearrange it into slope-intercept so we can see where x is to identify the slope, and then we can easily see the constant, which would be our y-intercept. This will also allow us, by rearranging it into y equals mx plus b, allow us to go and use the y equals button on our calculator to type in, and then we can go to a table to check to see if there are any ordered pairs that are in our on our graph line or in that equation. So the first one we're going to rearrange is we are going to rearrange 3x plus 5y is equal to negative 5. So the first thing you want to do when you rearrange is you've got to take this x and move it after the equals, because if you look here, your x with your slope is after the equal sign. So how do I move a negative 3x? Well, how do you move a positive 3x? Because this 3x is positive here. Well, you have to subtract 3x from both sides. Well, over here, I can't subtract 3x from negative 5 because they're not like terms. So I really have an invisible 0x here, and that's where I'm going to put underneath. That's where I'm going to write my minus 3x, like I did over here, so that my equation stays balanced. Now, do you always have to write the 0x? No, you should know that there are 0 x's on this side. That's why you don't see an x term, because there are 0 of them, and we don't write anything with a 0. All right, so I know that this is going to go to 0, and I am just left with a positive 5y equals, well, now I can bring down my negative 5 because I don't have any like terms to combine, and now here I'm combining 0 with a negative 3. Well, you know when you combine anything with 0, it doesn't change, so I just have that negative 3x here. All right, and now I don't want 5y, I want this to be a 1, so remember we're going to have to divide off the 5 because any number divided by itself is going to be 1, which means every number over here after the equal sign also has to be divided by that number. So I'm going to have y equals, because 5 divided by itself is 1. 1y is just y because we don't have to write that 1. And now I'm going to take care of my division. So now I always type it in as a fraction just in case it is a fraction. And that gives me negative 1. All right, now my second division, I really have a 3, but that 3 is negative. So when I type it in as a fraction, because fraction means division, I'm going to make sure that 3 has a negative sign with it, and my 5 is positive, so I'm just going to type 5. And now I have a negative 3/5. Well, what symbol do I have to write here to show that my number is negative? That would be a subtraction sign, 3/5 x. Now it is in y equals mx plus b format. It's in y equals format, so now I can just find my slope. Well, my slope is a negative 3/5. M equals negative 3/5. And if I ask myself what would be the slant of my line, what part of the graph line, what part of the adventure would slope dude be on, he would be on the nice negative, which means my line slants downward. And now I can look at this and I can see my y-intercept, and my y-intercept is the constant, which is negative 1. So I know it's going to cross the graph line at negative 1, and then we are going to be using this information in an upcoming lesson to actually start graphing our lines. All right, next one, 6x plus 5y is equal to 20. Well, the first thing I've got to do is move my x. So how am I going to move a positive 6? I've got to subtract 6x from both sides. And remember, it's going to go underneath that invisible 0x. If it helps to write it, please do, but know that you don't have to write the 0x piece. You just know it's already there. All right, so 6x minus 6x is 0. So we've got 5y equals 20. And then if I'm adding nothing to a negative 6, because 0 means nothing, it's not going to change. So I just have a minus 6x. And now I've got to divide off so that I end up with 1y. So 5 divided by itself is going to be 1. So I know that every number after the equal sign also has to be divided by a 5. So I want 1y. So I've got y equals 20 divided by 5. Let's go ahead and do that math in my calculator. So I'm going to type it in as a fraction. I've got a positive 20 over a positive 5, and that is equal to 4. And now I'm going to type in my next division. So I've got a 6, but I need to check the sign of my 6, so it's a negative 6 divided by 5. And that is going to give me back the same ratio, so that tells me that this was already simplified to begin with. So I need to make sure I write the correct symbol here since my answer is negative. So that means I've got to write a subtraction sign, 6/5 x. And now I need to identify my slope, and I'm looking for x. Okay, so x marks the slope, so my slope is negative 6/5. And if I'm trying to connect this to what part of the adventure slope dude is on, it is negative, which means it is a nice negative, and my line is slanted downward. And now I want to look and see if I can find my y-intercept part of my y equals mx plus b equation. It is 4. So I know that my graph line crosses at positive 4, and it is going to be slanted downward. We're going to solve the next two. So now I've got x minus y is equal to 3. So the first thing I've got to do is move x to the other side. So how do I move this x? Well, if you don't know how many there are, just ask yourself what number's here, and then hopefully you said a positive 1. So you are going to subtract 1x from both sides. And remember, there is a invisible 0x here. So that's going to make 0. So I have a negative y, don't leave off your negative sign, equals 3. And then if I'm combining nothing with a negative 1x, I've got a negative 1x here. All right, so since this negative, this really means it's a negative 1y, so I'm going to have to divide every value by negative 1 so that I can get that 1y. That positive 1y that we are looking for. So I'm going to have y equals, and now we're going to take care of our division. So I've got a 3, and I always type it in as a fraction, a ratio, 3 over a negative 1, and that is going to simplify to negative 3. You can certainly use division, but it's just easier if you get a decimal. So now I'm going to type in my next division. So I've got negative 1 over, because this subtraction sign tells me the 1 is negative, so I've got to make sure I type that negative in my calculator, and then negative 1. And it's going to give me a positive 1 as my answer. So I've got to make sure I write the correct operation sign here to show that my 1 is positive, and that would mean an addition, 1x. Now, on a multiple choice quiz or test, you would not see that 1 there. It would just be negative 3 plus x. But now it's in y equals mx plus b format, and now I can identify my slope and my y-intercept. So I'm going to look for x because x marks the slope. So my slope is a positive 1. Now remember, if it's a whole number, your change in x is always a 1. So I really have a change in y of 1 and a change in x of 1. And since it's a positive, I know that slope dude is on the puff positive part of this adventure, so my line is going to slant upward. And now I know what my y-intercept is because it is the constant, negative 3. And I know that my graph line crosses at negative 3. All right, one more. So we are going to rearrange 11x minus 4y is equal to 32. So I have to move the 11x to the other side. So if it's a positive 11x, that means I'm subtracting or taking away 11x from both sides. And again, if you need to write that invisible plus 0x on the other side, do so. And this is going to make 0x. So I have a negative 4y equals 32. And then negative 11x, if I'm combining it with 0, it's not going to change. It's going to stay a negative 11x. So it really looks like 32 minus 11x. So now I need to divide by negative 4 everywhere. And I'm going to get 1y y equals, so now I'm going to take care of my division. I've got 32 divided by -4, or you can think of it as the ratio of 32 over 4, -4, and that's going to be -8. And now I have another ratio, another division problem I need to type in, so it's going to be -11. Make sure you type in that negative with your 11, or your final answer is going to be wrong for this division, and then your 4 is also negative, so you have to type in another negative for that 4. And you're going to get a positive 11/4, which means you have to write addition symbol, because that means your number after it is positive 11/4. And don't leave off your x. If you leave off your x, you're not going to be able to identify your slope, and then you're going to get the wrong answer. So we want to have an x and a y in our final answers. So my slope is 11/4 because x marks the slope. So it's positive, which means that my graph line is going to slant upward because that's the direction of a puff puff positive line. And now I can clearly see that my y-intercept is a -8. Okay, and that completes our lesson on standard form equations.